Edward Langston, Eddie to those who knew him in the war, walks with quiet purpose down Maple Street. At 86, his frame is thinner but upright, disciplined from years of military bearing. He wears a weathered olive jacket with a faint, faded patch on the sleeve, 82nd Airborne, though few know it now. The morning is calm. The kind of suburban peace that conceals how much people forget the stories of those who came before. Eddie stops at his 1998 Buick LeSabre, a car as dependable and dignified as him. He runs a hand over the sun-worn paint, then slips into the seat. The interior smells of time and leather and oil changes done in his own garage. He backs out slowly. Every curve of Maple Street is familiar. 42 years in this neighborhood, and not once a ticket or a collision. He passes the corner store where kids used to sell lemonade, now a vape shop with LED signs. He nods to Mr. Garcia, who's trimming hedges. The man lifts a hand, but doesn't smile. Some neighbors know Eddie's name, most know only the old man in the Buick. He drives without hurry. The town has changed. The tempo has quickened, the patience thinned. Yet Eddie still uses his turn signal at every corner, still checks mirrors with the precision drilled into him long ago. His destination isn't urgent. Just the post office. A package to mail, his daughter's birthday gift. Handmade. No one makes things anymore. He parks carefully, centered between the lines. The world moves fast around him, but Eddie Langston, silent, deliberate, still moves with purpose. And today, like every day, that should have been enough. The turn onto Oak Avenue was routine. Eddie had made it hundreds of times. He signaled, checked his mirrors, and eased forward, trusting in the rhythm of traffic he'd learned long ago, like a second language. The sky was clear, no distractions, no surprises. Until there were. A shriek of engine tore through the calm. A black Aston Martin, new, low, loud, burst into view from the left. Eddie saw it a half-second too late. His foot slammed the brake. Tires howled. The world convulsed in one furious collision. Metal met metal with a violence that seemed impossible in such a sleepy street. The Buick's passenger side crumpled inward like paper. Shards of glass danced in the sunlight before crashing back down to asphalt. The LeSabre skidded sideways into the curb, lurching Eddie forward against the seatbelt. When silence finally returned, it was broken only by the ticking of a cooling engine and the distant honk of a startled driver far down the road. The young man emerged from the Aston Martin first. Tall, gym-built, and barely mid-20s, he wore expensive sneakers and a designer hoodie. A gold chain caught the light as he swiped his phone screen. He didn't look toward the Buick, didn't ask if anyone was hurt. Instead, he barked, "Jesus, man, didn't you see me? You cut across like you own the road." Eddie opened his door slowly. His fingers were shaking, but his breath came slow and measured. His instincts, honed decades ago, took over. Check limbs. Neck. Spine. No sharp pain, no disorientation. He stepped out, brushed glass from his lap, and surveyed the damage. The Buick's passenger side was demolished. The wheel bent, the window gone, metal bowed like it had melted. The Aston Martin's front bumper was cracked, the grille mangled, but the engine still idled with a purr. "Sir?" Eddie said, evenly. "I had the right of way. This is a stop sign." The kid scoffed. "Man, I was barely rolling through. You didn't even look. You were creeping across like it's your driveway or something." A couple of neighbors emerged from porches. Mrs. Tran, who Eddie helped repaint her fence last spring. Gerald and Lydia from across the street. Others, peeking through curtains. Whispers started. "He's getting too old to be driving. Heard he hasn't renewed his license in a while. Did he cause it?" The patrol car arrived too fast, like the cop had been waiting nearby. A young officer, early 20s, buzz cut, pressed uniform still stiff, stepped out. He glanced at the damage, then at the men. His eyes lingered a little longer on the luxury car. "Anyone hurt?" he asked. "No," said the kid, rubbing his neck dramatically. "But it was close. I had to slam the brakes. He just pulled out in front of me." Eddie stood silently. "You all right, sir?" the officer asked without really waiting for an answer. "I had the right of way," Eddie said again. "Calm." The officer replied, distracted by the young man's license and registration. "Any witnesses?" Nobody spoke. Gerald shifted awkwardly. Mrs. Tran looked down. Eddie watched it unfold. The kid's confident tone. The officer nodding. No field sobriety test. No phone check. No citations. The officer jotted notes, his pen flicking back and forth quickly. "You said he cut across?" "Yep. Outta nowhere." "You brake?" "Course." The officer glanced at Eddie, then back at the form. "'Cause undetermined," he muttered as he scribbled. "No injuries. Minor collision. Minor." The tow truck arrived. Eddie's LeSabre was hauled up onto the flatbed like a wounded animal. The Aston Martin was drivable, but the kid didn't want to risk it. He tapped his phone, called for an Uber. Before he left, he turned back toward Eddie. Smirked. "Time moves on, Pops. Maybe you should too." Then he was gone. Eddie stood alone beside the oil-slicked street. He didn't speak. Back home, the insurance company called the next day. They'd reviewed the police report. The officer hadn't assigned fault. Because the crash wasn't conclusively one-sided, the company would only cover a fraction of the repairs. The rest, over $4,000, would fall to Eddie. He stared at the estimate on the kitchen table. It was more than just money. It was insult. His savings were meant for emergencies. For repairs to the house. For maybe, just maybe, a trip to see his granddaughter graduate next year. Now, they'd be funneled into fixing a car he didn't even break. He looked out the window. Across the street, Gerald was trimming his hedges. He didn't wave. Eddie sat at the kitchen table for hours. Listening to the tick of the wall clock. Remembering crashes of a different kind. Helicopters downed in enemy fire. Medics yelling. The sting of iodine and the crack of bones beneath pressure. Back then, when something broke, he fixed it. When men went down, he lifted them up. That was who he was. Now they saw an old man in a big car. A burden. A statistic. And Eddie Langston had never felt more erased. The days after the crash moved like molasses. Time passed, but it didn't feel like it belonged to Eddie anymore. There was a fracture, something subtle but undeniable. A shift that no one saw but he felt in his bones. He walked home that day without speaking to anyone. 6 blocks of cracked sidewalk, garden gnomes, faded porch flags, and the occasional jogger with earbuds in. Not one made eye contact. A few slowed down, unsure what to say, but none stopped. Inside his house, the air was still. The smell of oiled wood and old books lingered, undisturbed. He set his keys on the hook and stood in the front hall for a long moment. Then he went to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. It tasted like nothing. He didn't turn on the TV. Didn't make coffee the next morning. He woke early, as always, but sat in the quiet instead of preparing breakfast. He didn't shave. Didn't open the blinds. The mailbox remained unchecked for 3 days. When he finally went to get it, the mailman was halfway down the street. He didn't wave. The Buick came back on the 5th day. A tow truck eased it into the driveway just after lunch. The passenger door looked pristine. The metal gleamed, fresh paint catching the light. But to Eddie, it wasn't the same car. It felt altered. As if something sacred had been stripped out of it and replaced with sheet metal. He didn't drive it. Didn't even sit inside. The neighbors offered shallow greetings. Some mumbled things like, "Glad you're okay," or, "Could have been worse." One left a grocery store gift card on his stoop. No note. None asked what really happened. No one came over to hear his side. At church that Sunday, Eddie stayed home. First time in years. He couldn't bear the polite nods and the quiet judgment. Couldn't stand the idea of being seen as the man who almost caused a crash, or worse, the old vet who finally lost it. Instead, he sat in the den, surrounded by silence. He stared at the medals in the shadow box above his bookshelf. The bronze stars. The combat medical badge. His old airborne wings. He hadn't displayed them to show off. They were reminders. Anchors to the past. Proof that when it mattered, he had stood tall, kept men alive, done what had to be done. Now, they looked like relics. Artifacts from a world no longer interested in remembering. A week passed. Then two. His daughter called. He didn't answer. The voicemail was short. "Hey, Dad. Just checking in. Hope you're all right. We saw something on Facebook, someone said you were in an accident. Call me, okay?" He didn't call back. Not yet. The sense of exile was complete. Not by decree, but by erosion. The slow dissolving of respect, recognition, relevance. He didn't leave the house for days. Groceries went unordered. Meals became canned soup or toast. He began cleaning compulsively. Not for visitors, but because it gave his hands something to do. He polished the floorboards, dusted every photo frame. He reorganized his tools in the garage, wiped every socket wrench, labeled every drawer. One morning, he opened a box in the attic. Inside were letters from the war. Faded and brittle. Some he'd written but never sent. Others were from buddies, some alive, some long gone. He read them all. Slowly. One read simply. "You got me through that day, Langston. They were all panicking, but you held it together. You don't know it, but I watched you. That calm? That's what saved me." It was signed, Hutch, a name Eddie hadn't said aloud in 30 years. He set the letter aside. That night, he stepped outside for the first time in over a week. The neighborhood looked unchanged. But something felt colder. A car drove past slowly. A young couple inside. The woman looked at him, then quickly turned away. He went back inside. He sat in his old recliner and stared at the wall for a long time. Eventually, he stood, walked to the window, and watched the Buick. Still and silent. Like him. He closed the curtains. The next day, he forced himself to walk around the block. Just once. He didn't look up when someone passed. He kept his eyes on the ground. He began walking again each morning. Early. Before most neighbors stirred. A quiet march with no purpose but movement. One morning, passing Oak Avenue, he stopped at the intersection. He stood there for a full minute. The exact spot where it had all gone wrong. A car slowed as it passed him. Inside was a young man in a hoodie, gold chain still around his neck. The same kid. They locked eyes. The kid said nothing. Just stared. Then drove on. Eddie turned back toward home. There were no more near misses. No more crashes. But something had broken nonetheless. Not a bone. Not a car. Something deeper. And Eddie wasn't sure how, or if, it could be fixed. Thursday morning came with a whisper of breeze and a sliver of spring sun slicing through the blinds. Eddie stood by the front window, coffee untouched on the counter behind him. He had resumed the habit of making a cup, though he rarely drank it now, just the motions, the steps, the semblance of normalcy. Outside, the street yawned into its daily stretch. Joggers passed. A delivery van rumbled by. Nothing out of place. He decided to walk. He wore the same windbreaker he always had, one with worn elbows and a hidden tear along the seam where a dog had once nipped at him years ago. Stepping outside, the air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass and gasoline. He adjusted his stride, knees stiff, right foot dragging slightly more than it used to, and turned the corner toward Elm Street. Halfway down the block, the rhythm of the neighborhood suddenly snapped. A sound like a plank hitting concrete echoed ahead, sharp, sick, sudden. Eddie's instincts kicked in before his conscious thoughts caught up. He quickened his pace, adrenaline jolting his legs into motion. Around the corner, a crowd had already begun to gather. They circled something, or someone, on the sidewalk near a bus stop bench. A voice rose above the murmurs. "Somebody call 911. Eddie broke into a jog. As he neared, people stepped aside. On the ground lay a young man, convulsing violently. His limbs flailed in sharp, uncontrolled bursts. Foam pooled at the corner of his mouth, and his eyes darted wildly beneath fluttering lids. The crowd stood frozen. One woman cried into her hands. A man backed away, muttering, "I can't watch this." Then Eddie saw the gold chain. The unmistakable Aston Martin logo tattooed along the boy's wrist. It was him. No swagger now. No accusations. Just a frightened, convulsing body thrashing in the center of a frightened crowd. Eddie didn't hesitate. His military training, long dormant but never forgotten, roared to life. He pushed through the circle. "Move back," he barked. Startled, they obeyed. Eddie dropped to his knees beside the young man. The jacket came off in one swift motion and was folded beneath the boy's head to cushion it against the pavement. "He's seizing," Eddie said to no one and everyone. "Keep the area clear. Give him space." He gently turned the boy onto his side to protect his airway. "Checked for trauma." His voice was calm, focused, the way it had been in the heat of gunfire and rotor blades. "Stay with me, son," he said. "You're all right. You're going to get through this." The boy's tremors slowed. The jerking subsided into twitching, then faded into stillness. He groaned, eyes half-lidded. Confused. Weak. Eddie kept talking. "You're okay. It's almost over. Just breathe." A siren cried in the distance. Closer every second. A young woman, tears streaking down her cheeks, crouched nearby. "Is he gonna be okay?" Eddie nodded. "He will be. Just needs help." When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics were fast but not panicked. Eddie had already done everything they would've. One checked the boy's pulse while the other hooked him to oxygen. "You a doctor?" one asked. "No," Eddie replied. "Combat medic. Korea. Vietnam." The paramedic gave a quiet, respectful nod. "You saved him." Eddie didn't reply. He watched as they loaded the boy onto the stretcher, stabilized now. The boy's hand reached out weakly as the gurney rolled past. "Thank you," he whispered, voice dry as paper. For a long moment, Eddie didn't say anything. Then, softly, "Just rest. You'll be all right." The ambulance pulled away. The crowd lingered in uneasy silence. Someone clapped. Then another. Soon a small ripple of applause spread across the group. Not wild or loud, just grateful. A man Eddie didn't recognize stepped forward. "That was incredible." Another, You knew exactly what to do. Mrs. Tran appeared at the edge of the sidewalk. Her voice shook. I didn't know you were a medic. Eddie looked at her. Most people don't ask. Someone brought him a bottle of water. Another offered to call a cab, not realizing Eddie lived nearby. Eddie declined both. He stood, wiped his hands on his pants, and nodded once. Take care, he said, and began the walk home. As he walked, every step felt strange. Not heavy like before, but unfamiliar, like he was moving through a world that had shifted again. But this time, something had opened. Not a wound, but a space. A possibility. Back at his house, he paused by the mailbox. Took a deep breath. Picked up the previous day's mail, sorting through the envelopes without even noticing. Inside, he laid the jacket back on its hook and sat at the kitchen table. The clock ticked. The air still felt quiet, but not as isolating. Later that evening, as the sky bruised into a soft purple, the phone rang. Dad? It was his daughter. I heard what happened. Someone posted it online. You saved that boy? Eddie let the silence hold for a moment. Then, simply, he needed help. You didn't say anything. I mean, you could have been hurt too. Why didn't you tell us? Eddie glanced out the window. The street shimmered faintly in the fading light. I don't know, he said. Didn't feel like it mattered. There was a pause on the line. Then her voice, quiet, it does. You matter. They talked for a while. Not long. But long enough to feel like something had started to shift. When the call ended, Eddie stood and went to the front door. He opened it. The night breeze was soft against his face. Across the street, a porch light flicked on. He didn't wave. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel invisible. It began with a knock. Saturday morning, 2 days after the seizure, the doorbell rang. Eddie hesitated before answering. It had been years since someone came by unannounced who wasn't selling solar panels or asking about gutters. He opened the door slowly, unsure of what he'd find. It was Gerald, from across the street. Hey, Eddie, Gerald said, sheepish. Just wanted to say, I saw what happened Thursday. Heard about it. You saved that kid's life. I didn't. I mean, I didn't realize you knew all that stuff. Eddie just nodded. Gerald stood there for a moment, awkward, then held up a foil-wrapped tray. Chicken pot pie. My wife made it. Thought maybe you could use a break from cooking. Eddie hadn't told anyone that most nights lately had been toast or soup. He accepted the tray without a word. Thank you, he said. That was the first knock. The second came that afternoon. Mrs. Tran stood on his porch, holding a small, steaming container. Pho, she said, as if it explained everything. I make it when someone needs strength. Eddie smiled faintly, touched more than he'd admit. Thank you. Others followed. Lydia brought banana bread. The Krugers left flowers with a card that read, "Thank you for reminding us what courage looks like." It was like the street had blinked and seen him, truly seen him, for the first time in years. On Sunday morning, Eddie put on his slacks and buttoned his best shirt. He polished his shoes for the first time in months. When he arrived at church, the congregation parted like the Red Sea. A few clapped quietly. The pastor even nodded from the pulpit as Eddie took his seat. After the service, a teenager, maybe 16, approached him. Mr. Langston? Are you the medic from Vietnam? Eddie raised an eyebrow. That's right. The boy beamed. My grandpa was over there too. Marines. He always said the medics were the real heroes. Eddie didn't feel like a hero. Never had. But something warmed in his chest. Word continued to spread. Someone on the neighborhood Facebook group posted a blurry photo taken during the seizure, Eddie kneeling beside the boy, calm, hands steady, like he was born to be there. The comments flooded in. Didn't even know he was a veteran. Shows how little we pay attention. We owe him more than a casserole. That man's a legend. Shame on us for assuming he was just some confused old guy after the crash. By Tuesday, the local paper had called. A young journalist with freckles and big eyes arrived on Eddie's porch. "I'd love to do a profile," she said. "Your military service, your life here, what happened last week, people want to know the full story." Eddie hesitated. "I'm not looking for attention." "It's not just about you," she replied gently. "It's about reminding people what quiet dignity looks like." He agreed. The article came out 2 days later, Veteran, Neighbor, Hero, the man behind the rescue. It featured an old photo of Eddie in uniform, standing beside a Huey helicopter, helmet under arm, face streaked with sweat and grime. The accompanying piece traced his service from Korea to Vietnam, his work as a combat medic, the honors received, and his decades of humble life in the neighborhood. The response was overwhelming. The mayor's office sent a letter of commendation. Veterans groups reached out. High school students sent cards with hand-drawn flags and "Thank you for your service" scrawled in every color of marker. One envelope, however, stood out. No return address. Inside was a short note. "You helped me even after I failed you. I see you now. Thank you. E." It was written in a shaky, narrow hand. No doubt who it was from. Ethan. The kid. That name hadn't been spoken out loud, not once, but it rang clear in Eddie's head the moment he read it. He didn't smile. But he folded the note carefully, set it inside a drawer where he kept old letters. Letters from soldiers, from friends, from people he'd helped in foxholes and field tents. Now this joined them. The next Sunday, Eddie was invited to speak at the VFW. He hadn't set foot in the post in over a decade. At the podium, hands resting lightly on the wood, he looked out at a room of familiar and unfamiliar faces. Men and women with stories not so different from his own. Some younger, some older. All watching him, waiting. "I didn't save that boy because I wanted to prove something," Eddie said, voice steady. "I didn't do it because I'm brave or because I thought anyone was watching." He paused. "I did it because someone was down. And when someone's down, you help. That's it. That's the whole code." There was silence. Then, applause, quiet at first, then rising. After the meeting, an elderly woman with silver curls touched his arm. "My husband always said the medics were angels in boots. You were his kind of soldier." He nodded, overwhelmed. Later that week, the pastor asked if he'd speak at the Memorial Day service. A local teacher called, asking if he'd talk to her class. Offers came in steadily, politely. Not demands. Invitations. Eddie accepted a few. Not all. He didn't want to become a symbol. But he didn't hide anymore, either. And maybe the most surprising thing of all, people listened. Not with polite disinterest, but real attention. They asked questions about his time in Korea. About the freezing nights, the medevac flights, the close calls. About Vietnam, too, how he'd kept a kid alive with a collapsed lung by improvising with a pen and a water bottle. One young man even cried. They saw him now, not just as a veteran, but as Eddie. A man who'd lived, lost, served, and kept walking forward. Respect hadn't returned with fanfare or apology. It came in casseroles, notes, handshakes. In eyes that met his again. In the way people said his name now. The knock came just after lunch on a quiet Wednesday, gentle but deliberate. Eddie had just finished washing the few dishes from breakfast. He didn't eat much these days, just enough to keep his body moving. He dried his hands on a towel, walked to the door, and opened it. Ethan stood on the porch. Gone was the gold chain. No designer hoodie. Just a plain button-up shirt, jeans, and scuffed sneakers. His hair was neatly combed, but his hands fidgeted at his sides, betraying nerves. The boy, no, the man, looked smaller without his arrogance. Thinner, too. Fragile in a way Eddie recognized. Ethan spoke first. "I wasn't sure you'd answer." Eddie said nothing at first. He looked the boy over carefully, not judging, just taking measure. The same way he used to study wounded soldiers in triage tents, trying to decide who needed help most urgently and who could wait. "I figured it was time," Ethan added. "I wanted to say this in person." Still no response. Just the steady gaze of a man who had once seen young men like Ethan panic, suffer, lie, and sometimes change. "I lied," Ethan said quietly. "About the crash. I was distracted. I was texting. I didn't want it on my record. So I blamed you." Eddie looked him in the eye. "I know." Ethan's face twisted in shame. "I shouldn't have. I knew it then. I just didn't know how to fix it." "You start by telling the truth," Eddie said. "Which you're doing now." There was silence. Then Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded check. He held it out, 2 hands. "I want to pay for the repairs. All of it. I looked up the estimate from the shop. This covers the difference. Plus a little more, for whatever." Eddie didn't take the check right away. He let Ethan stand there, arms extended, the weight of accountability settling in. Finally, he accepted it. Folded it once, slipped it into his shirt pocket. Ethan let out a shaky breath. "I also wanted to thank you. For what you did. After the seizure. You forgot your meds?" Eddie asked. Ethan nodded. "Yeah. I was late refilling the prescription. I've had epilepsy since I was 16. Usually under control, but when I skip a dose." He trailed off. "If you hadn't been there, I don't know what would have happened." "You were lucky," Eddie said. "Crowds panic. Most don't know what to do." "I saw the article," Ethan added. "The one in the paper. Your service. The medals. I didn't know." "Most people don't," Eddie said. "That's not why I helped you." "I know," Ethan said, voice barely above a whisper. "But it matters to me now." There was another pause. Then, cautiously, "I'd like to make things right, if you'll let me." Eddie gestured toward the porch swing. "Sit." They sat. The wood creaked gently beneath their weight. The breeze rustled the leaves in the elm trees, and a robin chirped from the eaves. "You grew up here?" Eddie asked. "Not far," Ethan said. "Down by Tanglewood. My parents divorced when I was 8. Lived with my mom. I moved out when I was 20. Thought I had everything figured out. You don't strike me as someone who asks for help." "I didn't think I needed it," Ethan admitted. "Until I did." Eddie looked out over the street. It was calm, familiar in its routine. Garbage bins neatly lined up on one side. Children's bikes leaned against a fence. A sprinkler misted a lawn across the way. "I've seen men die," Eddie said quietly. Men who thought they were invincible. Others who knew they weren't and kept going anyway. The difference is in the ones who learn before it's too late. Ethan nodded slowly. They sat in silence for a while longer, not uncomfortable. Just quiet. The kind of silence that follows hard truth and heavy moments. "I've been thinking," Ethan said finally. "About going back to school. Maybe nursing. Something medical. After that day, I realized I want to do more than just cruise through life." Eddie studied him. You sure? No, Ethan admitted. But I'm willing to try. Eddie gave a faint nod. That's enough. They talked a little more. Nothing deep. Just small things. Weather. The neighborhood. A memory of the corner store back when it still sold penny candy. When Ethan stood to leave, he extended a hand. I'm sorry for everything I said. Everything I assumed. Eddie looked at the hand. Took it. I've always believed, he said, that when someone's down, you reach out, not walk away. Ethan nodded. As he walked to his car, an older sedan, clearly borrowed or recently purchased, he paused at the curb, turned back. You think I'll be okay? Eddie didn't answer right away. You've got a long road, he finally said. But it's yours. That's something. Ethan nodded once more and got in the car. As the engine started, Eddie stepped back inside his house. The living room felt a little warmer, a little less still. He looked out the front window and watched Ethan drive away, not fast, not reckless, just steady. That evening, Eddie reached into his closet and pulled down a small box. Inside was a set of keys. Familiar, worn smooth by years of use. He walked out to the garage. The Buick sat there, bathed in dusk light filtering through the narrow window. Clean. Repaired. Untouched since its return. He opened the door, slid into the driver's seat. Everything was as he remembered. He placed his hands on the wheel. Turned the key. The engine hummed. He didn't drive. Not yet. But the hum told him everything he needed to know. Still his road.